Having been pretty well versed in the search and rescue operations for quite some time now, you run into quite a few sticky situations, as they would call them. I have so many stories I could share with you, so I'll do my best to unpack a handful for you, as I'm sure you'll find them at least somewhat entertaining, but also, like your channel covers, terrifying at the same time. One such story that immediately comes to my mind is a little 5-year-old girl years back named Darcy, who was captured or abducted by what she described as a large bear. From her own account, the bear had snatched her when her mom was not looking, was jumping through other trees, and even fed her berries, and explained to her that she needed to eat to not be hungry. She had gone missing on a beautiful clear Saturday morning when the park was full, brimming with people. The next thing you know, the mom turns her head for just 1 second. The girl was gone, mysteriously disappeared. That little girl was gone for 17 days straight, without anything. The only thing she had was the minimal amount of clothes she had on, since it was summer. She was found 4 miles away from the spot in which she'd gone missing, completely unharmed, playing casually, right in the middle of the woods, as if nothing was ever wrong. She was stumbled upon by an elderly couple who were hiking, had found her, and had turned her in. She was tearfully reunited with her loving mother, and upon being asked what happened, where did she go, she simply explained, "The large bear took me, fed me, take care of me." She looked very clean, had been well fed, hadn't missed a meal, and even her clothes, the same clothes she had been in for the last 17 days, upon the day she left, were completely spotless. No stains, no dirt. It's as if they had been washed and dried. Completely astonishing. Even more so considering she had been caught playing out in the woods, all by herself. She would explain to authorities and her mother that the big bear told her to stay put and that he would be right back. And that's when the older couple found her. She was then asked to describe what the big bear looked like, and being 5 years old, she calmly and collectively said, "Oh, he's kind of big and hairy, and he has big arms, and he has a very funny looking face, and talks weird, and really big teeth." They asked her, "Did the big bear hurt you?" She said no. "The big bear fed me berries and gave me water to drink." When asked where she had been sleeping, she told them and her mother that the bear had taken her down underground to a cave to sleep at night, where she was safe. Either way, this little girl seemed completely unfazed that she had been captured and taken by this big bear for the last 3 weeks. That's still one of the biggest mysteries. And when you look at stories from David Paulides, for example, his Missing 111, there are so many stories that line up with the same story that I dealt with on this day. This is not an isolated incident. In fact, many of the stories you would read in his book are nearly identical to the same stuff our search and rescue teams would deal with. Because being in search and rescue, you deal with a lot more missing hikers and missing persons than you would like to. It's just a part of the job. Like the fact that little girl was 4 miles away from where she was originally abducted. 4 miles. How does a 5-year-old walk 4 miles all by herself without getting dirty? And the terrain in which she was found, to the spot in which she was abducted, isn't flat at all. Due to the time of year, it's pretty rugged, with a lot of overgrowth and briar. There's no way she could have calmly made it over there by herself. I don't buy it. While I can't confidently say it wasn't human that took her, I know for a fact she was abducted by someone or something. What that was, I'm not sure. Of course, not all of our search and rescue missions go good. There have been other times and cases where we've recovered entire bodies, or pieces of bodies. One incident, we had a 35-year-old male go missing. Could not find a trace of him for 9 days, until about 15 miles away, in a completely isolated section of woods that dipped down into a large valley. We found his torso, completely naked, no blood, no arms, no head, no genitalia. Gone. Just his torso. We did not find any trace of his clothing, any of his equipment, nothing. No trace of any of those things around his corpse. And then you get some more disturbing stories. One time, we had a young lady, no older than 24 or 25, go missing. Luckily, we found her the same day she had gone missing. She was huddled up and terrified in a small section on top of a very large hill. When found, we had asked her why she had refused to come down the hill and why she had even been reported missing in the first place. She seemed completely terrified, eyes bugging out of her skull, completely ghost white. She said, in her defense, she refused to leave the hill because she was terrified of what she saw at the base. Circling around the entrance of the hill and by the trees, she said, was a large man figure covered in hair with red eyes watching her from the tree line. She said when she made it up there, it was impossible for her to turn around without that thing watching her in the woods. It had been there all day and was still there now. But when SAR officers went to go check it out, they found nothing. However, there were many large branches, all the way to 10 feet high, that were snapped and broken off, and this foul odor was reported lingering in the area, an odor that was reminiscent of death and rotting meat. She was rescued, but not further questioned. We had yet another young man who had just turned 18 going hiking with some of his friends when he had gotten separated from his hiking group. After picking up his scent, his body was discovered, torn in pieces. Something large ripped him to shreds. His backpack and all of his equipment was also gone. Upon further inspection of his body, it was written down as a bear attack. But I'm telling you, after personally seeing the mess myself, bears don't do that. Bears kill a very specific way. They eat a very specific way. This was not at all the way a bear would kill. Something tore this boy to ribbons. And to be honest with you, it didn't look like it did much eating. It looked like he was just torn apart and left there. There wasn't even very many identifiable parts of him left, other than a few articles of clothing and a piercing he had on a part of his face that was still intact. The entire time we were dealing with that, I got a strange feeling around where we were, like we were being watched. Of course, I still had to do my job, but that's just what goes along with it. Something attacked and killed this boy. What? I don't want to see it. All I can say was, after that whole mess was taken care of, I was happy to be long out of that area. Unfortunately, I was also tasked with informing his parents of his passing. That's never an easy job, as you can imagine. And as you probably know, many of us SRA officers are thoroughly informed not to speak to anybody about anything. We're told to keep a lot of this quiet. Even some of my fellow officers have been threatened with all sorts of things in order to keep hush-hush, especially by their superiors. There are so many cases that go deep into the wilderness, the things that people don't even know about. For example, people talk about the whole staircases in the middle of the woods. Yeah, that might be what people call creepypasta. But what people don't talk about is the staircases they find leading down. Staircases that belong to old, dilapidated buildings that are no longer there, or are barely there. Back in 2013, for around a 6-month period, I was the main guy to be patrolling the park. Sure, everybody else had their duties, but the evening time was my shift. I wasn't really doing anything special, just the pretty much mundane doing my rotations, looking for anything out of the ordinary, which I hardly did find. But there were a handful of times here and there that I experienced some things I can't quite explain. As a matter of fact, one evening, as I'm driving by myself, I see this weird flash of light in the sky, kind of like lightning. Yeah, think about that. But this was not a lightning bolt. In fact, the sky was clear of any overcast or weather patterns. In fact, I could see stars. What came after that bright flash was this large black object, slowly rotating and moving in the sky in a very strange direction. It's like it was going vertical, but east to west at the same time. I couldn't tell if I was looking at a cube or a circle or what this was. And I'm watching this thing, and it's moving all over the sky. And then another bright white flashes. Boom, it's gone. No trace of it. I just remember thinking, what the? Did I just see that? Trying to process what indeed I just seen, which I'm very confident was indeed a UFO. That was the precursor to this whole experience, because shortly after that, I would be driving towards the end of my shift, having completely forgot about this whole strange shape that I saw in the sky. Next thing you know, I'm enveloped by this incredibly blinding bright white light. Then, I look down at my clock. I'm somehow an hour and a half behind. What? I somehow went back in time. Of course, I didn't get enveloped by the light, and all of a sudden looked down at my clock. I'm just telling you what happened as far as an event had occurred. I have no way to explain what that was about and how that came together. The light enveloped me as soon as it dissipated. My clock before this was about 9:02 because I was about ready to clock off. When I came out of the light and it fully dissipated, it was now about 7:40. It was still dark out, so I could only assume I had gone backwards in time. I know that might be a crazy assumption, but afterwards I immediately went back to the station and began talking to my colleague who was sitting there at the desk. I was freaking out, of course, telling him what had just happened, explaining to him it was just 9:02 and now it's 7:40. He gave me a very strange look and said, "It's still an hour and 20 minutes till 9 p.m. Have you been drinking? Are you okay? Do you need to lie down?" I explained to him I swear what happened, that I swear that I was taken back in time by that same shape in the sky. I was not ready to write off that coincidence just yet. It still goes down as the most bizarre, freakiest story I've ever encountered while in the Ranger service. Hi, I'm writing in a story about an event that happened roughly 15 years ago, during the autumn back in 2001. That was the year I was doing my final exam as an environmental science student with the University of Exeter in England. For my final year, I was required to complete work experience, and I chose to complete mine as a wildlife ranger at the Forest of Holyhead, a wild, vast expanse of forest which spans for 7 miles in width and 12 in length. The whole experience was a dream come true, as I thoroughly enjoyed the job, loved spending time with the like-minded individuals who had a passion for nature. I had no idea where there were so many insects and creatures which I had been unaware even existed. The experience was scheduled to last only 6 months in total, but unfortunately, was cut short at 4 months, as something terrible and spooky happened, something which has haunted me these 15 years and has now prompted me to put pen to paper. When I first started my work experience, my supervisor, whom we'll call Allison, a red-haired lady in her early 60s, very close to retirement, warned me, and I kid you not, of sinister forces in the forest. When I pushed for details, she got kind of shady and nervous, did not want to speak further. It was the strangest thing. Allison was usually very jolly and very happy, upbeat, but talking about these sinister details, it would make her on edge. She just kept explaining to me, be careful. I assumed she meant shady guys roaming the forest at night, maybe cruising, or perhaps drug dealers used it as a meeting point. My mind did not go beyond that level of sinister operation. When I mentioned the conversation to the rest of my fellow colleagues, they too looked uneasy. They reminded me of a young boy, who we'll call Kyle, who was aged 7. He had gone missing in 1996 on a picnic with his family, had never been seen since. His grandmother spoke of something black and on fire that claimed her grandson. Weeks after his disappearance, she herself was admitted to the hospital, where it was later found she was suffering from advanced dementia and died shortly afterwards. My colleagues informed me that Kyle's parents never stopped searching for him. They believed something terrible and supernatural had happened in that forest, something of which had taken him and driven his grandmother to the edge. I speculate that the story may have been some ring of truth, possibly exaggerated over time, possibly for suspense or thriller purposes. Everyone loved a good ghost story, especially one about a forest. The story sounded spooky, but as I looked out at the autumn colors in the forest, I could never believe something that evil could occur out there. It looked picturesque, a haven for any creature. I was also shocked, as a large part of our job was to promote the use of the forest for people. If the story was true, then we were essentially promoting a murder playground. How could we get families to come? I thought. I dismissed the story as bogus, even laughing a little at my colleagues. They just told me to keep my mind open, that the forest had a long history of disappearances. I figured they had smoked too much. I even asked the secretary. She said she had been working in the forest industry for 30 years, but was adamant it was surely haunted. A few of us student rangers shared a cabin together in training. One night, we told each other ghost stories. There were 3 other guys in the cabin as well, so it was very boisterous and lively. The odd time we would have girls over, if we all got drunk, we would go skinny dipping in a nearby lake. It was a lot of fun. I was only 22, having the time of my life. There was a lot of crude jokes and pranks going on in the cabin, especially after several beers had been consumed. This night, one of the other guys, we'll call him Brian, got really drunk, began acting crazy. He opened the door to our cabin, yelling out like crazy. That's when he started yelling about Kyle, asking him if he boned Granny. A few of the other guys laughed at him, but it made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't know what to believe regarding this story about little Kyle's disappearance, but I knew it was beyond jokes. It was distasteful, as my mother always said, and karma has this funny way of getting to you. I explained to him, knock it off and come back inside, but he just kept yelling in a goofy voice. Just strange stuff. I couldn't believe he was acting this way. It was cringeworthy. Eventually, he came back inside, and we settled down for the night. When I awoke at 3 a.m., I looked over at Brian's bed just to check that he had not been sick. I squinted in the darkness. I couldn't make out his figure. I got up and went for a closer look at his bed. He was gone. His quilt perfectly made, which was the eeriest thing. His bed was always a mess, no matter what time of day it was. Why had he made his bed? I distinctly remember him getting into bed, snoring almost instantly. I panicked, checking the bathroom, the kitchen, our small living room. He was gone. I woke the others. We were all pretty spooked that he was nowhere to be found. He was in no fit state to go anywhere, and if he did, he would have likely fallen down or possibly drowned. We got dressed with our flashlights. Remember, this was 2001, so long before portable phones and really good flashlights. We decided to break up and start searching. I looked in our indoors bathroom, made sure he had not passed out in there. No sign of him. There were no signs of him around the cabin, but we did notice what looked to be fresh footprints leading into the darkened forest. It was like looking into a vast ocean of blackness, with the only sounds of hoots of owls or the trees swaying back and forth in a gentle wind. We began to get a little nervous, as although we loved the forest, it looked pretty creepy at night. I figured there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps Brian just went out for a walk and was going to stagger back to the cabin. But then I remember his actions. Just a few hours earlier, how taunting his voice had been, mocking the little boy who had disappeared. Icy fear welled in my stomach, and I wondered if any of the other guys had the same thoughts. I continued calling out, "Brian, can you hear me?" Nothing. My footsteps thread on the autumn leaves, crunching on the forest floor. This would have been a beautiful walk, had it not been for the fear of Brian's disappearance. I tried to illuminate as much as I could, carefully concentrated on every sound I could hear. I could hear him talking. "Help, help." His voice sounding anguished, sounding disembodied, but yet clear enough to make out. It sounded as if he was coming deeper in the forest. I gulped as I noticed how black and far in I was getting. I told him I'm coming. I called back. My heart was racing, not knowing what I was about to encounter. "Please help me. Help me." His voice was agonizing to hear in this state. I had never heard him in such pain or distress. He was clearly pleading, as if in his last moments. My heart felt like it was going to rip out of my chest. I began running, turning my head left to right, cautiously examining every little illuminated detail for any sign of Brian. I realized how utterly helpless I was. If he was able to be held by something sinister or dangerous, I had no defense mechanism. I was empty-handed, vulnerable, but still, I knew I had to save him. Although he had been a complete jerk, he did not deserve to die. I couldn't even bear to think what that would mean. The next sounds I heard were a large amount of frantic screaming. It sounded as if it was from a wild animal, but no one I knew it was from Brian. I began crying, starting to think it was in his last moments, asking, "Where are you?" I could hear him sobbing. I was now running, arms raised and ready to fight whatever man or beast was holding my friend captive. Then I stopped. Before me on the ground was Brian. He was kneeling and sobbing, dressed only in his boxers. His head was in the ground, and he was beating the forest floor with his fists. He had large red scrapes all down his back and a gash on his cheek. I walked up to him, being fully aware this could be a trick and this might not be Brian. But he turned to see me, and I knew from his eyes, vulnerable and terrified, that this was indeed my friend. I held on to him, putting his head in mine, allowing him to sob. I watched closely all around me to see if whatever had caused this distress to Brian would reappear. It was getting light now. It must have been 4:30 a.m. I felt whatever it was now gone. The other guys eventually found us, and we all helped to carry Brian back to the cabin. We told our supervisors and senior ranger what had occurred, not mentioning Brian's taunts towards the little boy Kyle. Brian was bedridden for 2 weeks, then had to be brought into the hospital for a severely infected wound. He never came back. We got a phone call about 6 weeks later, saying that his mother would be arriving to take Brian's stuff back. We asked how he was. Not good. I still haven't seen him for years now. But actually, I bumped into his mother about 2 years prior. He's been in a mental ward for the last 14 years. Whatever happened to him that night changed him forever. All he talks about is something black, fiery wings, and a viper's tongue that nearly took his life. Some of the other guys don't believe it at all, but I feel, as a ranger, something happened to Brian in the forest. Something dark. Allison had warned me after all. I don't know if it was the kid that took Brian or something else, but he was traumatized. I lost my friend to whatever happened in that forest. All the guys left after Brian's mom took his stuff out. Many of us could not sleep at night, not knowing what was out there in the forest. I don't know what happened to Brian exactly, but it was something terrible, and every time I think about that night, I still get shivers going up my spine. Hello, what lurks beneath? I can't tell you my name or where I actually work, but for the sake of what I have to relate to you, I will use the name Jim, and I will tell you that I do work for the forest service industry, where a stone is a particularly sunny color. Do you understand? I know that you usually deal in cryptid encounters, but I've come across some things that are just as out of this world and paranormal as you would ever understand. There's a few playgrounds scattered throughout the park. I mean, you'd expect that, having as many tourists as we do. Often, it's part of my job to patrol these in a regular circuit to make sure that things stay compliant, if you catch my drift. The way I usually carry this out, I park my car, I sit and watch for a few minutes, then I get out, take a stroll. If all's well, I go on to the next area. In the middle of one exceptionally boring day, I was doing my usual strolling during a very busy hour. Kids were out of school and parents were letting them run wild, probably hoping they would leave all that energy here. I watched as this little boy reminded me very much of my own son. A little girl with very white, rather pale skin and straight black hair ran over to him, asked if he wanted to come meet her grandparents. They were sitting over on a park bench with their backs to us. I kind of smiled at how easily children can make friends. Adults have a lot to learn. Towards the end of the day, there was the announcement of an Amber Alert. A very small boy had gone missing. A picture of the boy was officially released. It was the exact little boy I had seen with that little pale girl. There were gears turning in the back of my head all night, and I just could not put a finger on what it was that was bothering me. The next day, I was on patrol again, with orders to keep my eyes peeled for the same little boy that I had saw the day prior. I kept my eyes peeled for him all day. After all, he'd be hard to miss. He looked just like my son. I saw the same little girl from the day before, the pale skin and the dark hair. She came up to yet another little girl, asked her if she would like to meet her grandparents. That's when those gears in my head began working. There they were again, two older folks sitting with their back to all the kids sitting on a bench further up the trail. My eyes shifted over to the dark-haired girl and her new friend, who were agreeing to go meet the grandma and grandpa. That's when I made my move. "Excuse me, can I meet your grandparents too?" She wasn't happy to see me. She looked like I was ruining some fun of hers. She took the other girl's hand and led her up the trail, keeping me in sight with a sidelong look. I followed from a distance. The two girls stood in front of the couple. The dark-haired girl was definitely not happy to see me. The other girl looked confused, even a little frightened. "Okay," said the dark-haired girl, and rushed her new friend back to the playground. I strolled up to the older folks. They did not seem to notice me. I call that a greeting, as to not startle them. I thought they just might be hard of hearing, but they didn't stir a bit. When I came around to stand in front of them, I could see they were two withered up dead bodies, dry as dead leaves. Another Amber Alert went out that night, that time for the other little girl that the dark-haired one had led away from me. I grew up in the mountain, west, and have had a strong love for the outdoors as long as I could remember, actually. Something about the practically limitless opportunities to explore and discover new things to stumble upon. Something that few people have ever seen before. Absolutely fascinated. You can never keep me inside as a kid. I would be out about trying to find new sights to see or trees to climb. The world was my jungle gym. I spent much of my youth in the Scouts, volunteering every summer I could at camp. Let's just say it did not shock anybody when I ended up as a park ranger after graduating college. My first job was in a park that was somewhat small and did not have many employees on top of its piss-poor management. I found myself taking on all sorts of jobs throughout my time there. My tasks had their ups and downs, but none of them ever compared to the experience I had while patrolling a section of the reserve's forestry. I understand this is going to sound a bit dramatic. Perhaps it is. But that week was a turning point in how I approached my life in general. Up until then, I had an upbeat, optimistic guy, always trying to see the best in others kind of look. A very strong love for people, animals, and the planet we were sighted on. I mean, I still do to a degree, but I definitely approached my sentiment a far more naive manner in the past. While I was patrolling in the forest that day, a smell of smoke breezed past my nostrils. Turning my head in that direction, continuously catching whiffs as I followed where it was coming from. There, I found a small fire pit made up of boulders, probably no more than 3 feet in diameter. The fire inside seemed as if it had been out for some time, so I knew the chances of me catching the person who built it were slim. That was a bit frustrating. Visitors were absolutely not allowed to start fires, except in designated areas during certain times of the year, for very good reason. In the past, I would catch teenagers with all sorts of things, but few items ever presented a legitimate danger to the park. So, of course, the one time I stumbled upon something that I did, I had no indication of who was responsible. Not knowing what else to do, I dismantled the fire pit in hopes to discourage its creator from making one again, should they ever pass through the area once more. The rest of the day was pretty boring, and If I was being honest, I always took the time to appreciate the nature around me. But that didn't mean it was particularly exciting. I returned to work the next day, already having forgotten about the fire pit situation from the previous night. I had already let the other staff and my superiors know about it, but like me, they mostly just shrugged their shoulders and said to let them know had I found out anything else. And as it turned out later on in the day, I did. It wasn't anything inherently dangerous. However, it did feel far more threatening than the fire pit. I wound up spotting a grimy old stuffed animal of a deer, a string wrapped around its neck as it was suspended from a tree branch. Something about that chilled me far more than if the figure were something like a human doll. I mean, I guess if that were the case, it would feel too obvious, like somebody was trying too hard to spook people. Why would somebody choose a toy deer out of all the things to suspend from a tree was beyond me. I checked out the area a bit more, made out yet another fire pit. I wasn't too far away from the area where I had found the one from the previous day, so I was certain I would have stumbled upon it already. I began to wonder if the perpetrator returned after I left the site and reconstructed their fire pit. I took a deep breath, rolling my eyes, talking into my walkie-talkie about the second pit I had found, and then went over to deconstruct it, just to be sure I was not going insane. I left the site and did not return until later in the evening. Nothing was there. Satisfied with my work, I went home for the day. I had the next day off, but requested my coworkers to keep me thoroughly in the loop about whether or not they'd seen any new fire pits emerging. I didn't get any news. I was patrolling a different area of the park that day, and of course, once more, stumbled upon a fire pit. However, this time, it did not have any wood actually in it. It was just a circle of rocks. I reported it nonetheless. And it wasn't long before I heard my boss over the walkie-talkie to telling me to quit being so paranoid. I sighed, simply kicking the structure apart. I despise this game of cat and mouse. When I went on my lunch break, I decided to head back to one of the buildings and get some snacks out of a vending machine. I would ask the other staff if the night patrol had noticed anything strange. That's when I learned that the night patrol did not actually do anything, mostly just dicked around. When I asked if they were the ones responsible for building the fire pits, they told me no. I also brought up stuff about the hung deer, which was just met with responses of laughs. Nobody really seemed to care or be bothered by what was going on. I was the odd one out. Even though I wasn't getting paid to stay past my shift, I wanted to get to the bottom of this. I decided to stick around where night came. Instead of just going home late, I would sleep in my car if need be. After all, young curious me was determined to figure out to catch the person who was building these fire pits. I didn't tell anybody I was staying, out of fear they'd give me a hard time or make me go home. I turned off my only walkie-talkie and stuck around the area where I had found the most recent fire pit. After a few minutes, I heard the sound of people talking and pacing around. It was not long before a flashlight came into view, and I could make out two men walking around in what appeared to be gray cloaks, holding bags that seemed to be stuffed to the brim. I was perplexed, as anyone would be. One of them grumbled about how that guy kept kicking down their fire pits, and I watched as they built it once more. I was so curious and fascinated. I had completely forgotten to even try to put a stop to their antics. I was armed, so I wasn't in any danger, but I had no idea what these guys could be carrying. One of them opened his bag. There were just a bunch of sticks, and the other lit the fire. Then, I watched them walk around as they seemed to light up more fire pits until the entire area made one big ring of flame. There were a few calls, and a third cloaked man came out with a ladder. The second bag was opened. From what I could indicate, there was just a bunch of stuffed animals inside. I watched as they stringed up the animals onto the trees, before going to the center of the ring and lighting up what appeared to be a candle. One of them made a comment about how it needed to be quick, to which the other argued that their process cannot be rushed. I had no clue what was going on. Looking back, I still don't understand what their goal was. They all faced each other. Then, 2 more men came out and joined them. They all sat cross-legged and let out these low, melodic hums. By now, I came to the assumption this had to have been some sort of cult ritual. I was split on whether or not to intervene. I mean, I had no idea whether this was a nightly thing or seemed only planned. And if that was the case, I knew I would rather leave them alone, let them finish up and leave, so they wouldn't be a problem anymore. Another part of me knew it was also my responsibility to keep this park safe. Even past my shift, I was still on site. I admit, I didn't know what inherent danger these men possessed, besides the fire, which was still not allowed. It did seem to be well controlled, though. For the most part, these guys just really creeped me out. I could have approached them, but at the same time, like I said, I have no idea what kinds of weaponry they could have had concealed under their cloaks. I decided to just head back, before turning my walkie-talkie back on and informing the rest of the staff what I had just uncovered. They were mostly just confused about both what I was describing and why I was still around past my shift. I explained that I stayed in order to see what was going on, and at this point was fed up with nobody doing their job. So I let them have it, cussed them out quite a bit. They told me they would come up and help, but 20 minutes passes with no sign of anybody. That's when I decided to go back and confront my coworkers face to face. They were, of course, drunk and did not particularly believe me. I had to drag them out to my car and haul them to the place. However, by the time my headlights shone in that area, it was completely dark. We get out of the car. I take out my flashlight, and the stuffed animals were still hanging in the tree, and the fire pits were no longer burning, but emitted smoke. The sight seemed to make my coworkers sober up pretty quickly. We investigated the area a bit more. When we couldn't find these men, we sent out some people to look for them. We had come across several corpses of animals, like deer, coyotes, raccoons, all with ropes tied around their neck. We cut it off before leaving the animals to rest, and quickly dismantle the site of the ritual. There wasn't much else to do. There wasn't much else we could do. The search ultimately turned up nothing, and the fire pits stopped being built. No more stuffed animals. Like I said, this whole event shifted my mindset. While I still love the outdoors and exploring it, and discovering things it offered, it was also a great venue to conceal darker parts of the world. I suppose I just tread the world a little more carefully now. I've become a bit pessimistic in regards to my career. It has been a long time since I have worked at that park, and granted, I've stumbled across plenty of those close calls in the wild since. Confrontations with grizzlies, for example. Still, none of them ever shook me like that event. And to this day, I still feel a bit creeped out when I come across a pile of rocks. I've been a park ranger now for well over 30 years. At some point, they decided that they would take some of the workload off my feet, let me do most of my work at the visitor center, which is just about a third of the way into the natural reserve. My body appreciates their consideration for the condition that I'm in, but my mental health does not. Keeping on the move and always on patrol was my way of coping with things. Working out at the visitor center gave me more time to think. That's not necessarily a healthy thing for me. Suffice to say that I'm divorced and my kids do not want to talk to me, all while I'm facing my twilight years by myself. I'm not trying to draw attention to myself. Those will be necessary details in just a few seconds. They forced me to take coffee breaks if I had to go too hard for too long. So, I was taking one such coffee break on the outdoor wooden park benches, completely by myself. People don't come to the park to look around. Besides, the brochures of park information, the only thing the place has to offer is the same 4 or 5 fun facts about the forced posters that have been hanging up here for the last 25 years. We've all seen them. Nobody wants to see them again. I was yanked out of my thoughts when I heard a voice that I had not heard for over 15 years. I recognized it right away. It was the voice of my ex-wife, and she was calling my name. Just as my brain was trying to come up with a rational explanation as to why I was hearing her voice, I heard my daughter's voice come out to me also, except she didn't sound like the 43-year-old woman she had grown into. Instead, it was her 8 or 9-year-old voice. I was anchored to the park bench for a while, afraid to move just in case I was having a heart attack, a stroke, or experiencing something else that would mess with my mind. Maybe a near-life or near-death experience. Perhaps it was a practical joke, but who could mimic those voices so well and know my name at the same time? I decided to try a more tactical approach. I would come towards the voices, but I wouldn't answer them. There were long pauses between each call, as if my wife and daughter were waiting for an answer. But then they would call out again, and it was in those moments that I would pick up on the direction that they were coming from. Unless my ears were lying to me, it sounded like they were coming from the woods that came right up against the physical building of the visitor center. I stepped through the trees as silently as possible, resting when there was silence and walking when I heard voices. I came to an opening in the trees that couldn't have been more than 14 feet in diameter. It was clustered by some low-growing shrubs. I stayed hidden as best as possible. It sounded like the voices were coming from a small clearing. I didn't see how that could be possible. If my wife and my daughter were there, they'd be visible, unless they were lying down in the wild shrubs. I stared for what felt like forever, but then a shape slowly rose out of the growth, and the first thing I notice are these 2 large black eyes. They were proportionate to its head, the same way the eyes of a fly are proportionate to its head. Everything about it was just a little too long. The neck, the shoulders, the arms. It didn't stand up to its full length, just high enough to get a good look around, before it opened its mouth and spoke with both the voice of my wife and voice of my daughter, calling out to me, asking where I was and what was taking me so long. Then it sank back down into the brush. I could see its pale ribbed back bent over underneath the topmost leaves of the shrubbery. That's where it did its best to stay hidden. I pulled out my service pistol, and I shot as many times as I could before this thing realized there was a problem with its plan. At least 2 good hits bloomed black on its pale flesh before I sprang up and ran. I don't know if the other 3 or 4 shots hit or not. Miraculously, I was able to slip back to the visitor center and not have to offer an explanation to anybody. The older gal that works behind the front desk asked if she had heard something. I just told her I saw some kids setting off fireworks. My ex-wife may be many things, but somebody with the ability, let alone the intelligence, to send some strange, forest monster after me and lure me out with the sound of her voice isn't one of them. After this incident, I've kind of given into the urging of my superiors to spend more time in the visitor center, less time tromping around. There are clearly forces at work in this world that know more about me than I know about them, and the less I have to tangle with them, the better. I don't know if anybody's going to believe me, but there's only one way to find out. When you see the small town that I live in, you wonder why they even bother setting aside funds for patrol of the parks. You know, I guess you just never know when the trouble is going to come find the outside world in this little quiet place. Something that happened very recently has made me question whether trouble always comes from the outside. Our parks are small, but they are just big enough to have a couple of walking trails. If a day is feeling especially slow, I'll take the time to walk these trails, just for the hell of it. On paper, that means that I'm absolutely sure that there is no trouble whatsoever. So, one day, I'm walking the trail, and I get a real strong whiff of something good and dead. Not unlike the smell that might come from under your front porch when a squirrel or something else crawled away to die. But this was a strong, putrid odor. Something enough to make me question the size of the carcass. Once I could tell which direction the wind was coming from, I began to follow the smell. It led me off trail and into a thick of trees. The more crowded the trees got, the worse the smell became. This brought me into a very small clearing that I didn't even know existed. Here, I discovered scraps of sheet metal cobbled together into something like a shrine, complete with a peaked, corrugated roof. Small scraps were arranged into an altar. Behind it was a corpse that was set upright by a virtue of railroad spikes, driven through the chest and shoulders, pinning it to a large wooden crate. The legs were posed cross-legged. The head had been removed and replaced with a skull of buck with large antlers. Pink even still stained the skull, telling me that both the head and the corpse were about as fresh. Loud flies even filled the air. I don't know what to phone any of this in, as if it couldn't get any stranger. I saw something under the skull, lodged in the neck. There were papers, rolled up and weighed down by the skull. I phoned the whole thing in, waiting for dispatch, but nobody ever came in. I raised a holler over it, but everybody I mentioned it to just looked at me, like they didn't know what I was talking about, or they just didn't care. I called the paper to tell them about what I had found, but as soon as I told them which park, they hung up on me. Nobody around here is listening, and I don't know what to do about it. I don't think I can do anything about it. The park that I service gets virtually little to no traffic. Part of that is because of how small the town is. Another part of that is today's Americans just don't get out for fresh air anymore. It's kind of sad, really. I see the video games people play today, a lot of them involving getting out into the wild, enjoying the fresh air and hunting and surviving. And people are literally paying money for a simulation of things they could do if they just go and get out of the house. And yet, even as little traffic as our park gets, I still find just enough litter to make me irritated. As if people get out into nature just long enough to ruin it for everyone else. I was cleaning up some fast food wrappers off of a park bench when, among the trees, I noticed something a little different. There was one of those corn husk dolls, The old kind. They are fashioned after the type that Native Americans used to make. It didn't have a face, just a blank knob for a head, and 4 nubs for arms and legs. Kind of cute in a creepy way, I thought to myself, until I noticed a small piece of paper rolled up and tucked into one of its folds. I unrolled it, and it just said, "Hello there." I smirked myself, decided that I had found some garbage that was worth keeping. After I was done picking up all the trash around the area, I went back to my patrol car, where there was another corn doll stuck behind the handle of the door. It too had another message. It read, "I said hello." My skin prickled and I looked around. As far as I could tell, I was the only person in the park. I hadn't heard or seen anyone, but then again, I was very absorbed in my work when I was picking up the garbage. Perhaps someone was watching me, so they could have snuck in and put this on the door without me noticing. Still, I didn't like to think that somebody got me like that. I got inside my car, shut the door, and no sooner had I done that, I noticed yet a third doll sitting on the steering wheel. Yes, it had another note. It said, "Could you use a hand?" I nearly soiled myself when something smacked into the windshield. It took a second to register that it was indeed a severed arm and a hand cut off at the elbow. Blood splattering on the glass, slowly running down in streaks. Worse yet, it was a smaller hand. I immediately radioed out that we had a psychopath on the loose. The response came fairly quickly, but I wasn't sure if it was soon enough to keep up with whoever was inside the park. I didn't have much time, so I brought everybody up to speed, and there was a thorough sweeping of the park. They didn't find anything. No killer, no body, no evidence. Forensics did tests on the severed arm, found out that it did indeed belong to a child that had been missing for over 2 months. The arm that hit my windshield was relatively fresh, so that meant the kid was still alive when this happened. The rest of the day kind of just went by in a haze. I felt like a failure for not catching that monster, and all the moments that I could have when he was tampering with my car. My day ended on an ominous tone when I came home and there was one of those same corn dolls stuck behind the doorknob of my home. And guess what? It had a note. Let's play again soon. If you or someone you know has a story they would like me to read or share with me, please submit it to stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. I would love to read it. I'm going to try my best to keep not only my identity anonymous, but even some of the parks I worked at unknown and undisclosed for the time being. I don't want my information connected to my past work history at all, just for my own protection. Not to mention, any previous colleagues could easily trace this back to me if I opened up on too much information. I worked for a park ranger service for well over 20 years, mainly all around Colorado State. I've been a part of and worked on numerous search and rescue missions, and have just done my normal rounds as a patrol officer. You bet that I've had my hands full in things you probably wouldn't even believe. Nothing like seeing a portal, or demons coming out. Nothing that absurd. But I've seen things that I can't explain with my own eyes, or the circumstances that I found myself in. Today, I would like to share with you a few of the strange things that has happened to me while working as a ranger. The very first one that comes to mind is also the first in the chronological order of my history. Again, for the sake of anonymity, I won't tell you exactly what river, but it's one of the many main rivers that runs throughout the entirety of the state of Colorado. We had a hiker go missing. Search and rescue turned up unsuccessful in its attempt to rescue this hiker. In fact, no remains, nothing were ever found, and the whereabouts of that hiker remained unknown. About 7 or 8 months later, since this occurred in January of that year, now going to July or August, and people were reporting seeing in the evening and nighttime a miscellaneous random cloaked figure. This person or thing was seen to wear all black in like a hooded cloak, walking around the park. Nobody stopped them and asked them who they were or where they were going. I guess they were probably too scared. But I myself saw the same figure multiple times, sometimes during the evening and sometimes at night. On numerous occasions, I tried stopping them, but they always seemed to vanish out of thin air, like I was seeing some sort of hallucination or possibly an apparition that looked like a full physical being. Now, here is where the story I just told you and this black hooded figure tie in together. One day, I was doing my rounds along this river when I see this figure walking out in a part of the path that we're not supposed to go, at least for tourists. Us rangers can. Determined to get a hold of whoever this cloaked figure was that had been somehow managing to elude every ranger there, I pursued him or her for about a good mile or so, keeping about 200 yards behind him or her, watching them as they seamlessly crossed this very rocky and hard terrain, almost like it was nothing. I followed this figure all the way, for maybe 2 miles at most, to a large clearing in the woods, where I found a tattered backpack that had been severely weathered and worn out. Well, turns out, the backpack actually belonged to the girl who had gone missing back in January of that same year. A follow-up investigation was sparked because of the newfound evidence, and her remains were actually found probably within 50 feet of that clearing. There was nothing but bones left, and she had actually been buried about 3 feet under the ground. No signs of her ever actually being buried, though. It's as if she had just been buried in the ground forever ago, and just completely dissipated. Being in the ground for that long, you would see traces of other things, like clothing, or jewelry, or anything else. But she was so badly decomposed, being just bones, and even the bones were in such old condition. It was as if she had been buried there for hundreds of years. A DNA analysis proved that it was indeed her, and further refinement with dental records also proved it was her. But nobody could explain why she was buried naked, or why she was so badly decomposed in such a short amount of time. Which means that whoever this hooded or cloaked figure was a prime suspect. And maybe it was intentional, maybe it wasn't. But this figure led us to this girl's remains. Police and all of us rangers from then on out were on high alert, thinking this person, whoever they were, walking around the parks were very dangerous. And what's even worse, this cloaked figure was being seen all around the state, not just in this park, which means that it could have been a cult, more than one person. But by that fall, a month or two later, all sightings of this mysterious cloaked person completely vanished, ceasing completely. Nobody's entirely sure if that figure had anything to do with the murder or the remains of that woman, but after that, we never saw them again. Have no explanation for why or what they were. Many, including I, believe it was a person or a group of individuals responsible, a part of a massive cult here in the state of Colorado, also responsible for many sacrifices and murders, which we also believe is responsible for many missing persons. Which brings me to my next story. I remember the year. It was 1999, the summertime, and a man who was an avid fisherman and outdoorsman. His first name was Bill. I won't say his last name. He had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. His family was camping in one of the larger state parks in the state. One morning, the family woke up to find him not in his tent, his sleeping bag vacant. Everything he owned and had was still right where he had left it when he had fallen asleep. But he was missing. No trace of him anywhere. Even though there was an outhouse nearby and a bathroom, nothing. Nobody had reported seeing him. No traces, no footprints, nothing. When there was a search and rescue put on, dogs could only trace his smell about a half a mile into the woods, and then abruptly stopped at a large incline, about a 300-foot incline to be exact. Then, about a month or so goes by, and I hear from a fellow colleague that they had found a severed hand, knifed into a tree. So imagine a hand, severed, and then a knife placed through the palm, right into the tree. Once found, DNA tests were ran to see and determine who it could have belonged to. Everything pointed back to Bill, which again reopened yet another investigation. But why? Why would his severed hand be 7 miles north of where he disappeared? It made no sense. The person who found it was a lone hiker on a solo 50-mile hike journey through the Colorado state. And after thorough investigation of the surrounding areas, of not only where Bill disappeared, but where his severed hand was found, there was no evidence, no blood trail, even no scent trail. The dogs refused to go past the 100-foot perimeter of where his hand was, and they acted very strange, which is very weird. Even the knife that was found going through his hand into the tree was also tested, but no DNA would come up. Only Bill's DNA. It's yet another gruesome mystery that still remains unsolved. Oh, and another horrifying detail that I did not want to forget. While this specific investigation was going on, and I've only heard this a handful of times, this being one of those cases, keep in mind that when researching and when out on the field, it was daylight savings time. Sundown wasn't till around 7:38 p.m. at the time. But somehow, when they had found the hand and were thoroughly searching the surrounding areas, it got dark at about 4:30, 5 p.m. Only in that area though, because when radioing away to a completely different area, maybe 50 miles, the sun was still out. Something unexplainable was causing darkness, or the illusion that the sun had gone down. I understand if you read this and probably think I'm crazy, but I'm telling you first-hand accounts from not only me, but my colleagues as well. Strange, unknown experiences nobody can really explain off. The only thing we can do is just be completely baffled by what we've all gone through. Which leads me to my third and final experience that I will share with you today. This was right around 2007. I was down in the southern portion of the state. Again, I won't name the nearest town, but it's not a small town. And I was doing a casual patrol when I began to smell a very strange smell. It was kind of like a cross between wet dog, death, and a very thick, musty odor. My first thought was that a pack of wolves or something had killed a large elk, but the odor just kept growing in intensity. Then I began to feel like something was watching me just beyond the trees. Feeling immediate danger, I grabbed hold of my pistol and began scouring the area just in case I might be under attack. God only knows if there's somebody that hides in the woods that will try to attack you. That was my first thought. Then, as I'm looking, I see this large brown figure standing about 2 trees in, just beyond the tree line. And from where I'm at, I'm gonna guess this figure was easily 8 or 9 feet tall, massive, covered in hair, and poking its head out beside the tree to look at me. For about 2 seconds, I saw this animal or creature's face, and it was really, really ugly. Let me just stop and say that I've heard multiple accounts of Bigfoot. I've read stories, I've heard people talk and show me casts. I've even seen the Patterson film. I feel I have a general idea of what they should look like. But this thing that I saw looked nothing like a hominid, or any sort of Neanderthal or advanced ape. Its face was almost protruding outward, and had a short, flat snout. Think of like a bulldog. And had large, nasty, gangly teeth sticking all out of its mouth. It almost kind of reminded me of some kind of troll or orc from like maybe the Lord of the Rings, except covered in thick brown hair all over its body. The eyes were a dull red, very dark, very set in its skull, and it had massive long claws at the end of each of its fingers as it grabbed a hold of the tree and watched me. It didn't look like it was angry or aggressive, just very intently watching me, as if it was waiting for me to see what I would do or how I'd react. As I'm looking at whatever animal this is, or whatever it could possibly be, I keep hold of my pistol, because, frankly, I have no idea whatever this thing is capable of, and I was not taking any chances getting ready to find out. After maybe a few more seconds of intently watching me, it pulls itself back behind the tree, completely concealing itself from all visibility. I keep my pistol at the ready, just in case whatever unknown animal this is decides to act on instinct and attack. Maybe 20 seconds goes by, but when you're in that continuous state of fear and paranoia and anxiety, 20 seconds seems like 5 minutes. Everything kind of just went back to being calm again. Noises returned around me. The smell kind of dissipated, including the carcass death smell, and I never saw the figure move anywhere. I did investigate, and I never saw it behind the tree, even when I looked. So I have no idea where it could have gone. There's no secret trap door. There's nowhere that it could have gone without me seeing it. So where exactly did it go from being behind the tree? It's like it just vanished. But I'll tell you what, after that little stint in that portion of the trail, I more than had my fill for the day. And so I got out of there, even though the sounds had returned, and the smells had dissipated, and the feeling of being hunted was gone. I heavily opted not to take that same route again the following day. I want you to keep in mind that these are only a handful of experiences that I've dealt with personally. I've had more. I've had colleagues who've dealt with stuff that are far more terrifying, far more strange, and far worse. Maybe sometime I'll talk to them and have them tell their own stories. But for now, I'll just leave you with these. I hope you find them entertaining. My goal is that whoever you read this to, or if you do decide to come forward with this and go public, share this information with your own audience. My hope is that it will help others go public with their own experiences, instead of fearing ridicule, being paranoid by what others may think or judge. It's best to get the truth out there and let people know that there's things going on, the things even as a ranger I couldn't explain, that I was told to not talk about or write off completely. I've kept so much of this information suppressed for such a long time. You probably wouldn't even believe the sleepless nights that I've gone through, the many bottles of liquor I've drank down just to process, to keep this information subsided. But maybe this information getting out there will benefit for the better. I sure hope it does. As always, let's keep in touch. I would love to share more encounters with you. I got a bunch, ranging from all different varieties. Just let me know. If your audience enjoys these, well, I'll be more inclined to share more. Before I became a teacher, I had a very short-lived career as a ranger. I'd grown up in a heavily forested area and had been an avid hiker and camper. It had seemed like it would be fun and a pretty easy job. Right after college, I got hired by the National Park Service and even had a brief placement in Utah before being relocated to Tennessee, specifically the Smoky Mountains. It was a beautiful area, and I was really looking forward to spending summertime there. Instead, I got the summer of hell. It began well enough. As a newbie, I was doing a ton of patrolling, routine safety checks, which was fine by me. I got to roam around the gigantic park, sometimes going hours without seeing anybody. A few weeks in, I got the first weird call. A family had reported animal tracks all around their site, It wasn't a big deal. All parks have some wildlife. But when I got there and saw what I saw, I clearly thought one of the other rangers was messing with me. That maybe it was a hazing thing for the newbie, me. There were tracks, but they were weird. They definitely were not canine or bear. They were human-shaped, but huge, with claws at the end. I checked out the area, took some pictures, and then helped the family get another campsite. I turned the pictures into my boss, expecting her to laugh and give up the joke. Instead, she was pretty angry. She thought I was the one playing the joke. I asked her to come out to the site with me, but by the time we did, the rain had washed away all prints. 2 weeks later, I get another phone call. This one was worse. The campsite had been completely trashed, tents shredded, everything nearly destroyed. Luckily, the campers had not been there at the time. This camp was in a very grassy area, so there weren't any footprints. But I did find some light brown tufts of fur on the ground. This time, my boss saw the destruction herself. She marked it in the books as a bear attack. The fur didn't resemble anything like a bear, though. It was much longer. Finally, in early August, I got a call about a lost pet. A young couple had been walking their dog, and it had slipped its collar off, taken off into the woods. They were devastated. A few of the other newer rangers and I got picked to head off into the woods to find the dog. We broke off into pairs, knowing that going too far off trail was dangerous. I was with Brian, a decent guy I had sort of become friends with the last few months. We walked for hours, doing our best to cover our area. We whistled and called out, but did not see any sign of the dog. There were 2 hours left of daylight, and we had not got any other pressing calls. We agreed to stay out until dark before going back to the parking lot. As the sun began setting, we turned around and made a beeline for the nearest trail. We still had maybe 20 minutes or so until we got to the trail, and then we would have yet another 15 minutes on the trail itself. We felt bad about not finding the dog, but there was nothing else we can do. Halfway to the trail, we began hearing the noises. Growling sounds, a low howl. The missing dog was a lab. Labs did not howl like that. No dog I've ever heard of does. We grabbed our bear spray, hoping it would work. It was almost dusk now, so inside the forest, it was getting quite difficult to see. We looked around, but could not identify any source of sounds. We kept walking, hoping to leave whatever it was far behind. At the same time, Brian and I noticed an odd-looking tree. It looked like it had been mauled. Huge scratch marks and missing branches, not unlike what a bear will do. I pulled out my flashlight and looked around the base of the tree. There again were the huge footprints, and they were not a bear's. In fact, they were just like the ones I had seen months back, and they were huge, or human-like. Claws at the end, and very narrow. This time, though, somebody else was seeing them with me. Brian's eyes got pretty huge, and he began swearing. We were suddenly very aware that we were alone, and it was nearly dark. We were still far from help. We picked up our pace, going quickly as we could in the twilight. We kept hearing the crashing and grunting sounds, but kept moving. Twice, I saw a dark shape run past, but the trees made it impossible to see what it was. It was large, tall, which was concerning, to say the least. We were nearly running as we approached the trail, or where we thought the trail was. We had to be within yards of it when the creature came barreling out of the woods, crashing right into us. I had a glimpse of a dog-like face before it knocked me into Brian, and we both went tumbling down the slope together. We rolled for seconds before hitting a tree. I looked back up the hill to get a better look at what had come at us. Staring down at us with glowing eyes was a creature I only thought existed in people's nightmares. It continued to stare and growling as we locked eyes. I could clearly see drool dripping from its mouth, and this had me petrified. Brian was frozen too, staring at this animal. Dark matted fur, towering high above us, built like a beast. It easily could have been lifting weights. Finally, I snapped to and grabbed a large branch for a weapon. Brian and I limped out of the forest, bruised and sore. It was well past dark by the time we got to the parking lot. The other rangers were waiting for us. They were worried, asked why we were so late. Under the lights, they could see that we were totally scraped up, and we explained what had happened. Before they could even respond, I showed them the shallow claw marks on my shoulder, where this creature had hit me. I told them that it was some kind of upright wolf or dog. I had no idea how else to describe it to them. Even though I had Brian backing me up, nobody believed us. My boss was just angry at me, threatened to reassign me. So I quit. I'd had enough of whatever that thing was roaming in those woods. Coincidentally, that missing Labrador was never found, and I can't help but think that the animal that I had discovered that day had something to do with it. Two years ago, another ranger and myself found a giant pentagram in a small clearing of trees drawn on the ground, like 20 feet in diameter. Most of the trees surrounding it were locust and had black beads hanging from the thorns. We found it at night too, but clearly whatever took place was several days prior. Fast forward to last night. We see a car parked at the dead-end road near that area. I figure it's just people fishing, but we decide to go check, make sure it's not an illegal campsite. Well, we get down there and can't find them, so we begin walking to the shoreline, stumble upon two women sitting inside of another pentagram, holding hands and chanting. They had a blanket down and a bunch of books. There was also a piece of driftwood in it, where they made an altar out of various fruits and leaves. Made contact with them, and they kept insisting it looked weird, but they were just messing around. Mid-conversation, the woman grabs this green canvas bag, kept clutching it, while I try to figure out what exactly they're doing. I was pretty creeped out, but kind of decided they were just weirdos, and ultimately weren't harming anything. They admitted that they had been here before, and that site we found 2 years ago was indeed them. And told them to make sure they don't leave anything behind this time, and left. Still unsure exactly what they were doing. We figured it must have been some related to the eclipse last night. Who knows for sure? That wouldn't be my first experience or dabble into occult-related experiences being a park ranger. That stuff happens out here far more than you would think. Far more than you can ever imagine. For anonymity, I won't say exactly where this happened, but I will tell you this did occur somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. I was doing my usual patrols one night when I get radioed from one of my colleagues that suspects he's found 3 unmarked graves. Well, I come over, check it out with him, and it does indeed look like just like that. And it does appear to have 3 large holes that were dug recently and then covered up, just in the shape as you would digging a grave. The police came in and excavated these holes, and it turns out we were right. They were unmarked graves, but for who and why? Out here in the middle of nowhere, about 7 miles from the nearest hiking trail. It made no sense. The graves were pretty fresh, but the bodies in them were very badly decomposed, mostly bones. What's very disturbing about this story is that all three bodies exhumed from those graves were all very, very large men, 7 to 8 feet tall. No, these were not Bigfoot. These were clearly human skeletons, just 3 gargantuan-sized men, clearly decomposed. So we had all these questions. Where did these people come from? Why were they naked? There were no traces of any clothing. Why were they so badly decomposed, and who buried them? I can't remember if I told you already, but this was right around 85, 86. And the police and the coroner were all just as baffled as me and my colleague were. Easily one of the strangest finds I've ever had, even to this day. I work at quite a rural park in Massachusetts. We have a small nature trail that we have never really seen much pop up on before. However, the past few weeks has been different. 2 weeks ago, we got a report of a raccoon tail and entrails on the trail, something we have never heard of before. So, we went down, and right where the fork is in the trail, the only place that everybody would see, there is a pile of intestines in the middle of the left trail, and a severed raccoon tail in the middle of the right trail. Once we looked ahead, we found a raccoon head right at the start of the fork, staring straight out of the entrance. There was no blood, no bones, no anything. Just those parts. We went down a little bit and found a rock that had a bit of trash near it. Very unusual for our trail. It was the perfect rock to be able to sit on and be able to see the entrance of the trail without anybody seeing you. Right in front of the rock was a skeleton. So at least we found the rest of the raccoon, right? Wrong. This skeleton had its head intact, with its fur in a pile next to it. A different animal. We have had rangers on this site for years who have never seen a dead animal anywhere close to the trail. We just found 2. Since then, some other weird things have popped up. One in particular was a knife thrown into the middle of the overgrown area at the trail. The other of which looks like some type of pentagram logo drawn into the ground with a small square and triangle in it. We still have no clue why it was there.